Let's chat today about one of my absolute favorite topics, which is binge eating. And I don't love to talk about binge eating because I think it's, particularly fun, but I love to talk about binge eating because I think that it's so important. And I also believe that there is such a component, an element of binge eating of secrecy, of shame, of hiding, of feeling so lonely and so alone when you are going through it. And so I love to take every opportunity that I can to talk about this topic. And the opportunity presented itself today as one of our amazing listeners sent me this question. Simi, I am struggling so badly with binge eating. I read in your book, Letting Go of Leo, that you also used to struggle with binge eating as well. Can you share what helped you to get past this? And are you truly past it, or do you ever have a binge? So, absolutely love this question. Absolutely love this topic. And I'm so excited to dive into this with you all today. The first thing that I want to say, and I hope that this will be a really helpful reframe, a different way of thinking about what you are experiencing for anyone who is currently experiencing binge eating, which is that I personally have never seen a situation where binge eating is actually the problem that needed to be addressed. It's typically a response or a reaction to something deeper that is going on for the person who is experiencing the binge eating. Then I want to offer this reframe right up front because I think what most of us who either have experienced binge eating or are experiencing binge eating want to do is to address the binge eating because there's so much discomfort and there's so much shame, and it can be a really painful experience mentally, emotionally, but also sometimes physically as well. And no one wants to feel that kind of pain or shame or discomfort. And it's very natural when we're experiencing that to want to fix it, to want to deal with the thing that on the surface appears to be creating so much pain for us in our lives. And on the surface, it looks like that is binge eating. Now, I'm not going to say there's never a situation in the entire world where binge eating is the thing that needs to be addressed directly. I'm sure maybe there are people who that has been true for. But what I have seen time and time again is that binge eating is a reaction or a response to something deeper that is going on. As always, I want you to reflect on your own personal experience and think about, are the things that Simi's sharing, do they ring true for me? Am I connecting with this? Does this feel true? Uh, If it doesn't, that's totally fine. I would never want to tell you what you are experiencing. But what I am going to share in today's episode is my framework for approaching binge eating that not only has helped me to heal my relationship with food, binge eating included. And no, I do not ever have a binge anymore. I cannot remember the last time, like it's been maybe over like a decade now at this point, so definitely over a decade since I've had a binge. And so this framework supported me in finding that healing from binge eating. And I have worked with so many private clients on this topic, on this area of their relationship with food and really their relationship with themselves, and have seen this framework be so supportive. And so, what I'm going to share today is that framework. And then you can layer that framework over your own experience and decide, does this feel true for me or not? So, my personal story involved binge eating, like this listener mentioned. And I share, a little bit about this in my book, Letting Go of Leo, How I Broke Up with Perfection. But for today's episode, I will give a very Cliff Note version of my own personal story. I was someone who, from a really early age, always felt like a little bit uncomfortable in my body, right? I noticed that maybe my thighs were bigger than my friends. I was never super athletic, but a lot of my friends were. So I always felt like, I'm not athletic enough. And I was so into celebrity news. I loved reading magazines about celebrities, and I was always, like looking at their bodies and thinking, I wish my body looked like that. And wanting to find articles where it talked about, what they ate or how they moved their body, those kinds of things, like from an early age. And I would say that, like middle school through high school, there were times where I had a challenging relationship with my body and with food, times where I would think like, oh, I'm going to try to do like this kind of diet, kind of like secretly, also, I was born in 1986. So this was happening like in the 90s, early 2000s. Most people were having, a similar experience to this. And I would try to do things like that, maybe would have like a challenging, couple of weeks with my body, would try to eat in a more restrictive way. And then there were also times, many times in middle school and high school, where I honestly wasn't thinking about that. Like I look back and I can see inflection points of discomfort and challenge and struggle around that. But I can also see a lot of moments where I really wasn't feeling like there was an issue. It wasn't in the forefront of my mind. And so it was a back and forth during that time. And then when I got to college, things got really challenging for me. I went away to school and I experienced a lot of depression at the beginning of my time in college. My first year in college, my freshman year in college was very challenging for me. And I was eating emotionally a lot during that time. And I also was, yeah, struggling with my mental health. I was struggling with depression. And the first half of the year went by, we went home for winter break, and I had been wearing like a lot of sweatpants and a lot of pajama pants, as many people do when they go away to college. And I got home and we were getting ready to take Christmas photos, like a Christmas card photo. And I realized like none of my stuff was fitting. Everything was feeling really tight. And I started to have some body panic. And like I said, this was not the first time that I had, you know, negative feelings about my body. That had been something that I had lived on and off with for as long as I could have remembered, but that was really triggering for me. And I went back to college, and someone in my dorm invited me to go for a run with them. And I started running, and I was like, never a long distance runner before that. The longest I think I had ever run was the mile at school in gym class, and I honestly hated it. But I went for this run and I started running. And it, in the beginning, it really was good for me. Like it got me out of my dorm room. It got me moving my body. It got me in fresh air. The two women who I ran with were so kind and just really lovely. And it really was a positive addition to my life. And then I started to notice the more that I ran and the stronger of a runner that I became, I started to notice my body changing. And then I started to like that. And people started to make comments about my body, and I started to like that. And long story short, it was a slippery slope, which I will not go into all the details of, that took place over the course of a couple years, including when I went from undergrad to law school, of running more and more and more, adding in more exercise, different forms of exercises, 2-a-day workouts, becoming incredibly obsessive with my workouts, and simultaneously becoming more and more obsessive and restrictive with the way that I was eating. And I had always been someone who had been interested, like I said, in like what celebrities were eating and sort of dabbling like in different diets. And this was like fuel on the fire to that. At the same time, I was going through a lot of digestive discomfort because I didn't know, but I had celiac disease, an autoimmune condition. And so my first year in law school, I was exercising so much, true exercise obsession. I was so restrictive with food, and I was having a lot of digestive issues, which then made me even more restrictive because I was cutting out certain food groups and different foods. in an effort to actually like feel better in my stomach. And then I got my celiac diagnosis. So I found out like what was really going on. And that unlocked a whole other level of fear around food for me because now I was terrified of eating gluten or anything that had been cross-contaminated with gluten. And that just took it to a whole other level. So these are sort of the layers that we're, adding one on top of each other. Not to mention that law school was an intense environment, I'm sure, as anyone can imagine. And I was also trying to cope with some of that intensity by feeling in control and controlling what I ate and controlling how I moved my body and trying to control how my body looked gave me a feeling of being in control in this really intense environment. And so all of these things were happening simultaneously. And then I started to experience binge eating. And the binge eating would start where I would come home from a day at law school and I was hungry because I was really restricting my food intake and really over exercising. And like, so I was restrictive with food, but then also the over exercising created an added level of restriction. And I was hungry. And so I would open up the cabinets and I would think like, I'm just going to have a spoonful of almond butter. And then I would feel the almond butter in my mouth and taste it. And it was like, oh my gosh, I need more. And then I would say, I'm just going to have one more spoonful of almond butter. And soon I had eaten like half a jar of almond butter. And then I would start eating like other snacks that were in the house. And it, these, these binges got more and more intense and started happening more and more frequently. And that is when I freaked out. I was like, oh no, something's not good. Because when I was really restrictive with food and I was over exercising, I felt like I was doing the right thing. I felt like I was quote unquote good. I got a lot of praise. People praised me for my willpower. People commented on my body and my body looking good. And so I got a lot of external validation during that time. Also, I felt like I am good when I follow these rules, right? These self-imposed rules. And anytime I could check all the boxes, I would feel like I was good for that day. And then these binges started happening and I panicked and I'm like, oh no, I have a problem. My problem is that I can't control myself around food. I'm getting so out of control. And so then that made me want to control even more and want to restrict even more and want to work out even more. And I do want to share that at this moment in time, I did seek out support from an RD at the time in Chicago. And I went to her and I said to her, I am really struggling. Like, I'm out of control around food. I can't stop. Like, there will be these times I'm in my apartment. I'm like secretly eating all this food. And Tim and I had moved in together and we each bought our own groceries. And so there would be times where he would come home and he'd say, like, did you eat all my peanut butter? And I would say, like, no, it wasn't me. Like, who else would it be? There's two of us who live in this apartment. Did someone break in here like just for the peanut butter? No, that did not happen. Like, obviously, it was me. And I would just lie like straight to his face. I was just like, it wasn't me. Like that Shaggy song wasn't me. But it was me. I was the one eating all the peanut butter. Tim, I know you know this now, but also like confessional, it was me. I was eating all that peanut butter, all of our peanut butter. And so I go to this RD and I'm sharing with her, I'm out of control, help me. And the advice that was given to me in that appointment was that I should restrict my calorie intake even more than I already was, which I'm not going to share the number of calories I was eating at a day during that time because I don't want it to be fuel for anyone. I don't want anyone to get any ideas, but it was not a lot. It was very restrictive. to the point where I can't even believe that I was surviving at that time. And she gave me a more restrictive calorie intake and showed me how I could design meals in my day to fit within this even more restricted calorie intake. So I'm sharing this not at all to like put that RD on blast or anything like that, but to say that this is the environment that we are in as we're trying to heal our relationships with food. All of the sort of like mainstream conventional advice is, oh, you're binge eating, let's restrict more. Oh, you're binge eating, let's control more. And it isn't helpful. I'm just going to say that right here. It's not helpful. That's not the advice we need. That's not what helps or works, but it is what the messages that many of us are receiving, even from professionals that we're going to receive like support. So I keep in no surprise to anyone, I continue to binge eat. And I also start gaining weight. So I am binge eating all the time. I'm still being very restrictive and controlling about food. I'm still exercising so much more than I can even wrap my mind around right now. But I'm also having these binges and my body starts to gain weight. And I'm just plagued by the fact that I cannot keep my body at my smallest place anymore. And I cannot out control these binges. And I was so scared and I was so lonely and I was so ashamed. And for anyone who's been in this situation, I'm sure that you can relate to those feelings because I'm yet to speak to someone who has struggled with binge eating who has not felt that way, right? There's just so much shame around it. And I think that, the reasons why there's so much shame around that are because we are told that to be good is to be in control. To be good is to be in your smallest possible body. To be good is to be moving in the direction of, like eating less, weighing less. Like these are things that for, ever, we are taking in these messages from different sources. And maybe the messages that you've received have or have not been that direct, but these messages can be sneaky and they can be insidious. And I'm sure you can reflect on your life and your journey and your experience and say, like, yeah, I got those messages one way or another, right? And so when you are told that eating less and weighing less and being in control are the things that prove that you are doing well, that prove that you are good. And then this thing is happening where you feel so out of control and you literally feel like you are hovering above your body watching this happen and you can't do anything about it. It creates so much shame. And then shame makes us want to keep it secret, right? Because I don't want anyone to see how bad I am. I don't want anyone to know how bad I am. I'm going to keep this secret. And then the shame just grows and grows and grows. And we're struggling with this in the dark, in secret, all by ourselves. And this is why binge eating is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because let's flip on the lights and let's make it not so scary and let's make it not so shameful and let's make it not feel so lonely to be going through this. And that is what I'm hoping that the framework that I'm going to share with you can help you to move from, I am so alone in this, I am so ashamed, I am so bad, to seeing like, wow, my body is doing everything that it can do to help me to survive and to thrive. And there is a very good reason or reasons why this is happening. And when I connect with myself around those reasons and when I learn how to care for myself in those reasons, that's when healing gets to happen. And so, like I said, I'm in a bad place. I'm in a dark place. I'm not in a good place. And I graduate from law school and I moved from Chicago to Columbus, Ohio, where I then, in a very quick, short period of time, had a lot of life changes. So I had a move. I studied for the bar exam, took the bar exam. I started my job as an associate at a law firm. So I got my first job as like a licensed, legit, real attorney. And I also got married. And all of that happened within, I think, like 4 months, if I'm calculating months correctly, something around that time, right? So, we don't fact check on this podcast. It was around 4 months. And I'm also, as I'm recording this, I'm 38 at this time. And so all of this happened, like this moment that I just described, I was 25. So it's been years, right? It's been a lot of years since this time. So my dates, my exact dates and timelines may be a little smudged at this moment in time as I'm looking back over a decade later, but I'm going to do my best to recall accurately for you all. So lots of changes, and I'm on my honeymoon, and I am, you get all this, I got all that, not you get all this. I got all this lingerie for my honeymoon, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna put on some piece of lingerie that I got. And so I go into the bathroom and I put this piece of lingerie on, and we're in Quebec City on this beautiful honeymoon. Quebec City in the fall is like heaven on earth. So amazing. Highly recommend it. Shout out to Quebec City. Very beautiful. It's very lovely. It's very romantic. It's very fall. And we're in Quebec City and we're having, this wonderful time. And I'm with the love of my life who I just married. And we're going out to dinner, as you do on vacation, on your honeymoon. We're going out to dinner, and I'm sitting at these dinners, and I am so in my head thinking about how many calories are in this meal. What are the ingredients in this meal? What time am I gonna have to wake up tomorrow morning to get a run in to, like, you know, pay, like, to burn off this meal and to pay penance for this meal. Like, all of these really disordered, I want to call these thoughts out as disordered because they are these really disordered thoughts that I'm having. And I also just want to address my relationship with food and my relationship with exercise at the time was very, very, very disordered. Okay. So this is not me promoting these thoughts or promoting this behavior, but I think it's important to have context. And so then we go back to the hotel room, and I'm like, I guess I'm going to put on this piece of lingerie. And I put on this piece of lingerie, and I am just like crawling out of my skin. I'm so uncomfortable. I hate myself. I hate my body. There's no way that I'm walking out of this bathroom. And I'm like, the door's locked. I'm having a full breakdown. Tim's like knocking on the door, like, are you all right in there? No, I'm not. I'm not all right in here. When my daughter's like really upset, and we're like, sweetie, are you okay? She's like, no, I'm not okay. And that is me. That was me in that moment. I'm not okay. I'm not okay in this moment. And I finally just shared with him. I'm like, this is my world. This is my reality 24/7. I'm thinking about this stuff 24/7. My mind is a chaotic mess of all of these just horrible, super stressful, critical thoughts about my body. I'm obsessing about food. I can't let it go. I can't not think about it. It's like I'm playing Tetris with how am I gonna follow all these rules and make everything fit and work. And when I don't, I hate myself and I've got so much shame and I'm having these binges. And he said, I think that you need some help, right? Like, you deserve to feel better. You deserve to get support. Let's get you some support when we get home. And so I got home. I Google, I don't even know. This was before I ever knew a health coach existed, but I Google, I'm like, someone who can help me like not hate my body. And, my health coach, Amy Marsloff, who I just love, shout out to Amy Marsloff, my angel. She popped up, and I looked at her website and I just thought, this woman's speaking directly to me. I set up a consultation with her. I cried the entire consultation and I started working with her. And that was really the page one of a new book in my life, which was like my book on healing, right? Like really healing my relationship with myself. That was day one. That was page one in that story. And that was 13 years ago now. And I am just so thankful that I took that step because it allowed me to unlock my own healing, and it allowed me to create this framework that I have been able to work with so many incredible coaching clients within to help them to find their own healing as well. And not everyone's story is the same. And I'm not saying your story has to be like my story, but as I go into this framework, I just want you to know that I understand the pain of experiencing binge eating, and I understand the layers to it, and I understand why it feels so shameful. And I also understand what healing means. And it is revolutionary to your quality of life, and it is revolutionary to your relationship with yourself. And I want as many people to experience that as possible. And so now I'm going to share the framework. Okay. So you've heard me say already in this conversation that binge eating, from what I have seen, and I have seen a lot of binge eating in the last decade plus of having this coaching practice. From what I have seen, binge eating has never been the thing that needs to be directly addressed. What it is actually the response or the reaction to the thing that needs to be directly addressed. The binge eating is your body responding and reacting to this other thing that is going on. And as hard as it can be, I want to invite you, as you're listening to what I'm sharing, to reflect on the positive intention beneath your binge eating and to start to reflect on this with more compassion and less judgment. And I think understanding binge eating as the response, the reaction, rather than the root, can really help you to see this through a more compassionate lens rather than the judgment, and it can help you to feel differently in your experience rather than the shame. And so typically what is at the root of binge eating is restriction. Okay, so the root is almost always restriction, and I want to offer you some different ways that restriction can show up for us. I like to think about restriction in sort of three main buckets. The first is physical restriction. And this is a really important one to look at. And I would invite you to reflect on physical restriction first. Restriction can be not eating enough. So it might look like calorie restriction. It might look like going for long periods of time without eating. It literally could be the restriction of food and nourishment, physical nourishment in general. But it could also be the restriction of a certain food group, a macronutrient, right? So you might be someone who really restricts carbohydrates, or who really restricts fat, or who really restricts protein. Like you might actually be restricting a food group. So while overall you're like, I am technically eating enough, you may not be eating enough of all of the things, right? And so it could be restriction in general of the physical nourishment. It could be restriction of a really important kind of food, kind of nourishment that your body needs. And so those things are really important to look at. Look at physical restriction. Now, I'm not saying this is easy or straightforward. And in this podcast episode, we're not going to be able to unpack all of this, but obviously there are reasons why people are physically restricting, right? They have been told, for many people, they've been told this is the good choice, or this is the right choice, or this is what you should be doing for your health. And so there are definitely, challenges that can pop up when we're looking at physical restriction. But I want to invite you first to reflect there. Is there any physical restriction going on for me? And the second bucket of restriction that I like to look at is mental restriction. And this is where we might see food rules. So there have been a number of clients, many, like I'm talking about hundreds of clients who I have worked with around binge eating. And many of those clients have said, I used to be really restrictive with food, but I've, done some work on my relationship with food and I'm not restricting anymore. And I'm still binge eating. So the next thing that we're going to look at is mental restriction. And that is having those food rules, that noise in your mind that tells you you shouldn't eat that, or this is your last chance to eat that. We're not going to eat that anymore. Or that isn't that, like, you can't have that. It's that mental voice of restriction that can come in. And you may or may not be adhering to those rules. So I think that's a really important thing to point out here. The mental restriction doesn't mean that you're following those rules. It just means that you're hearing them, right? Your relationship with food is impacted by this inner dialogue that you have going on, this restrictive inner dialogue. So I'd love to invite you to reflect on mental restriction. Is there mental restriction going on there? And then the third kind of bucket, like the third layer here, is what I refer to as emotional restriction. And this can show up in a lot of different ways. This can be if you have emotions or feelings that you are not allowing yourself to feel, that you are not allowing yourself to process. And again, I'm not saying this like, okay, yeah, you identify it and then it's all better, because there are natural challenges to feeling our feelings, right? We may have been conditioned to push them down. We may have had trauma, and so feeling them feels very scary. We may be experiencing intense grief and don't yet have the tools or the skills developed to be able to be with those feelings fully, right? Like there's so many things that can come up here. And of course, like, these are things that I dive into with my coaching clients, or that you can dive into with, other care team members on your recovery care team, or therapists, or whoever it might be. I'm not saying that you have to do this all in a single moment, or that you have to have all the answers, or you need to, do it all now, or you need to do it all alone. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I want to give you today is a different way of reflecting on your experience, so that you can start to see light at the end of the tunnel, so you can start to feel hope, and so you can start to identify some really supportive next steps in your healing journey. So the emotional restriction might be that you're pushing down or numbing out, or not processing certain emotions. It may also be connected to what I have coined the craving trifecta in the work that I do with clients. And I noticed many, many years ago that almost all of my clients' cravings could be boiled down to these three things: rest, pleasure, and connection. And I think as human beings, we crave rest, pleasure, and connection. And so where we are feeling deprived of those things, where rest, pleasure, and connection are, where we're like in a state of deprivation of one or more of those things in our life, binge eating can be a reaction and a response to that, right? Maybe subconsciously, your binges are the only time where you really feel like you get to just like unplug and disconnect, and it feels like a moment of rest for you. Maybe it feels like your only time of rest, or maybe eating an entire tray of brownies feels like this is my only pleasure, right? This is my only pleasure in my day. This is my only pleasure in my life right now. Maybe it is the only time, maybe you are craving, some kind of connection and you're not getting that. And the binge eating is a way that you're dealing with those feelings, right? And so I just want to share that at the root of binge eating is almost always some form or forms of restriction. And so this framework, thinking of, okay, is there physical restriction going on here? Is there mental restriction going on here? Is there emotional restriction going on here? And can I identify one small area that I want to work on or a next step that I want to take? And this is where, the intuitive eating framework can be really, really supportive with the physical and mental restriction components, also a bit of the emotional restriction component as well. There are emotional health aspects to the intuitive eating framework, of course. Intuitive eating framework can be like really supportive in helping to process through those things, but also getting to know yourself, getting to understand yourself, getting to know your preferences, getting to learn what you like and what you don't like. And in my own healing journey, I had to hit every single one of those restriction buckets. I had to work on physical restriction. I had to work on the mental restriction and I had to work on the emotional restriction. And I am so grateful each and every single day that I did. Not that it was easy, not that it was quick. This work is not like one and done, super, quick, fast work, but it is work that creates a landscape of true self, deep self trust and connection and nourishment and care that you get to live in for the rest of your life. And this is a framework around binge eating that you can always come back to self-connect and self-reflect and identify what would feel supportive to work on moving forward rather than just trying to control more and control more and control more when you feel out of control with those binges. Because my personal opinion is that healing binge eating is not about getting in control where you feel out of control. It is saying, I am going to trade this dynamic of in control and out of control and trying to exert control over myself when I feel out of control. And truly setting that aside and saying, instead, I am going to learn how to practice connection and trading control for connection. This framework can really help.